Strong leadership isn't when times are good, but when chips are down, and the path forward is unclear. Throw in navigating a crisis and having to make tough decisions is certainly another level of complexity to navigate. But this is where true leaders shine. And the current market is certainly not smooth sailing, and everyone feels the pressure in one or another way, from talent shortages to economics uncertainties, from rapid technology changes to shifting consumer behaviors. And exactly in times like that, we turn to those who've been through the fire and who've led organizations through those turbulent waters and came out stronger on the other side. And today we've got the privilege to have with us a leader who's shown resilience and strategic acumen throughout those very challenging time. Brendan Stewart is this week's guest. Brendan, thank you so much for being here.
It's a great pleasure.
Honestly, Brendan, I'm really excited for this conversation because, as I just said in the short intro, you've been through the fire and through the rings. You've worked with and for some of Australia's most significant and largest agricultural organisations. You have chaired the Australian Wheat Board. You've also led the Grains Council of Australia, from vice presidenting over the National Farmers Federation to steering Queensland's peak sugar industry body, Cane Growers, as CEO. Talk about high-profile roles. So obviously, the first question is, did you always know that you wanted those high-profile roles, or what led you to this path?
Well, the short answer is no. I didn't know that I was going to end up in the high-profile roles, but I think, Petra, from an early age, I had a will and a desire and a craving, if you like, to do more than what I was doing. And I grew up on a family farm on the Darling Downs, and I worked very long hours out there. But I think I always had in the back of my mind a thirst to use my noggin a little bit more than what I was using on the farm. So I got involved in the agri-political sector, so representing farmers, because I was very passionate about it. I'm still very passionate about agriculture, and I think there's so much opportunity in the agriculture sphere. But that took me to organisations who were inevitably either under-resourced or were in their own way being challenged in their strategy and their sustainability. And through those ended up in organisations such as AWB Limited, National Farmers Federation, and then CEO of Cane Growers was my last corporate gig in a sense of being a full-time executive.
Everyone says, and I'm very curious to learn about your experience, but everyone says it's lonely at the top. Did you experience the same, or were there specific situations where you had people to actually support you, where you could call? Because some of the challenges and the crisis that you've gone through wasn't something that you just have a look, the paint by the numbers approach where you can solve that. But what was your experience like being in those roles?
But probably the most challenging of that was that when I became very unexpectedly the chairman of AWB Limited, which was then an ASX listed company. I was just 30 years old. I didn't come through the normal corporate background that many senior executives, C-suite executives and chairs did. I came through essentially what was a flawed structure, which I suppose enabled in one sense me to flourish and shine. But I was thrust into that role when the then chairman was not re-elected at an AGM, and we went back to the boardroom, and the board, essentially asked me to take on the leadership role of the organisation. Now, at that stage, I was the youngest ever ASX listed 100 listed chair. That was a huge challenge for me, but something that I relished because I think I've always had that passion and desire to jump into challenging roles. So most importantly, I think when that happened to me, the first thing I did was recognise that I didn't have the experience and the skills that many others who found themselves in similar positions did. So I sought out some mentors, and I spoke to a number of people who were on my board, and knowing that I didn't want to mentor within the board because I didn't think that was an appropriate thing to do, I asked them for their recommendations, and I went and sought out some very high level chairs of organisations that had long distinguished executive careers, and they were really helpful in setting me on the path to ensuring that I did the best possible jobs that I could. Later in life, I have to say that one of those directors did become not only a very close friend but an extremely good mentor. But probably my earliest mentor was a gentleman I worked with who was a farmer at Gundawindi, and I won't mention his name, but probably the wisest head out of both the business and political level that I've ever had. So I think for anybody who's climbing the ladder, independent, trusted mentors is so critical to their success.
Absolutely. And obviously, mentors is one piece to the puzzle when it comes to navigating those challenges, but then also resilience and also the strategic insight and foresight is another skill that you need to have. And especially as a 30-year-old, you may think you know it all, then realize when you turn 40 or 50 or 60, oops, there's a lot more that you should know. But how did you build this level of skill at such a young age?
Well, I think the first thing you need to do when you find yourself in these situations is to understand yourself fully. Now, that's a journey in itself. And that journey, I have to say, doesn't start and end in your first role. It continues. And for me, it's still continuing today. And you would know that from some of the discussions we have from week to week. But I think also understanding your own strengths and weaknesses. Resilience is an interesting concept, and I think from my personal perspective, I think resilience is something I believe is part DNA and part lived experience. At a personal level, growing up on a farm, I was surrounded by an extremely resilient group of people, men and women who'd battled isolation, fire, flood, drought, disease and trauma. Fantastic men and women as mentors and guides for a young man in the bush. But I was always taught to pick yourself up and dust yourself off and move on. I think that childhood also taught me to be very strategic in the allocation of scarce resources. Because in farming, you can have a plan, but when you're dealing with Mother Nature can throw some really curly obstacles at you, and therefore that plan, has to change. And so therefore you're also taught, I think, to develop a unique ability to be nimble, and I think to be able to pivot almost on the spot. So those skills have really assisted me, and I think never losing sight of the goalposts in a farming vernacular, even though sometimes the goalposts might shift on the try line, to use a rugby analysis. The try line's always going to be in the same place, but sometimes the posts do shift, and you have to be ready for that.
This is such an interesting insight with being very resourceful, because as you just said, in farming, you can't just say, let's work out plan B because something didn't quite go to plan. And this is also what you bring now to the table in terms of working with leaders and organizations. What can we do to leverage what you've got to make this goal achievable, or whatever you want to do actually possible?
And I think too, when you grow up in the city, and I'm very fortunate now to live in an urban area and close to the beach. So, I have been fortunate. But when you grow up as a child in the bush, and, a lot of my friends lived in very, very isolated areas, and, I'd holiday with some of them on their properties, you learn to be very innovative because you can't just duck to the shop. Ducking to the shop to grab a carton of milk is, a 3-hour round trip or a 4-hour round trip, or to get a part fixed. So you become very innovative in your ability to actually source out resources that you might not normally use in a circumstance, and basically repurpose them to do what you really need to get done, to keep going until you can actually then go and get what you really need to make the repair, if you like, a permanent.
I love this analogy, because now in your role as strategic advisor and strategist to CEOs and leaders, it's exactly that, bringing a new or different way of thinking to solve a new challenge, because the challenges and the complexities that we are seeing now, we have never experienced on that level with AI and, the economic crisis. Obviously, that has been here before, but everyone feels the pressure in one or another way. And you've certainly overcome and gone through a lot of challenges. What have been some of those hairy situations, and also how did you actually overcome them? Because also back then there was not a previous case study that you could just read on and then just copy their behavior.
Yeah, look, I've reflected a lot on this over the years, because I've found myself in leadership roles in organisations that really are transformational leadership roles. They're organisations, as I mentioned in the introduction, that have either lost their statutory funding or their statutory legislation that allows them to operate, and in a sense, their guaranteed income. So, or their guaranteed membership base in the sense of the sugar industry. So, I found myself in organisations undergoing fundamental change, and I think, from my perspective, it's been lack of good strategic leadership and planning that has led them to that. And when you think about that and you dissect down through what's caused that, the biggest challenges is in one way or another have all had their genesis in poor governance and the governance structure of the organisation, whether it be a poorly written constitution, an ill-conceived organisational structure, a lack of process and accountability, and aspects of board and management that have not been chosen well to fit the strategic imperatives of the company or the shareholders, which in some case in the not-for-profit sector are in fact members. So that has, if you could summarise it into a few dot points, it's fostered bad behaviours and culture. It's led to division and misalignment of management. It's allowed egos to flourish over objectives. It's given, management has become disillusioned, and the board, as the board takes their eye off the ball because of the infighting, as a result, management's not being held to account. So in essence, everybody loses sight of their fiduciary duties, and it's a very unenviable place to find yourself in. Sometimes it's a quick deterioration, and other times it's a slow decline. But let me say, this can also happen very easily in family businesses, and I've witnessed that as well, as both a family, as a friend of families, and as an advisor. If everyone's not aligned, and that can be very, very sad. But you know what? You've always got to try and look for the positive, and in every crisis there's opportunity, and you've got to really sometimes search hard to find what that opportunity is.
And speaking of crisis, you have certainly navigated probably one of Australia's biggest crises. How did you handle that particular situation, especially with so much pressure also from the public, not only from your own board and the organization, which is already challenging enough, but also what did you learn to now help organizations and leaders mitigate the risk based on what you've done?
Well, the first thing that any organisation should have is a crisis plan. And many don't, and that's not necessarily a failing of management. It's sometimes, particularly companies that are in early stages of development and scale-ups, just haven't got around to that level. But I always encourage organisations, particularly startups, and to start with the intent that one day they're going to be listed on the ASX. So try and run your organisation as best that you possibly can against the principles of the ASX listing guidelines. Now, you may never be there, and you may never want to be there, but what that does is it gives you a grounding in terms of accountability, compliance, and transparency. So it makes you actually think about all these things that you need to do. So in my instance, we did have, in the one organisation, we did have a crisis management plan, but it wasn't around governance crisis, it was around operational crisis. And I think most organisations will think of that, but they need to think of governance crisis as well. So I think for me, it's the first thing to do is know who your stakeholders are. And most companies, they're either manufacturing something or they're developing a product or a service. They will think of themselves as, the development side and the sales side, and so the customer. But depending on what type of industry, for example, financial services, those sorts of things, there's a whole range of others. You've got regulators, you've got legislators, you've got media, you've got not only your customers, but you might have banks who are financing you. You might have syndicates of financial institutions. If you're operating overseas, you've got international trade laws. Know your customer legislation. You've got legislation and regulations in each of the countries that you might sell to. You've got United Nations laws and sanctions, which up until the AWB crisis weren't actually a part of Australian law, but which now are a part of Australian law. So, you've also got things like sanctions that are put in place by other governments. So if you're dealing in US dollars, for example, with a country that is on a US blacklist, you might have to think about whether that's worth it, because that can breach US laws. So you might need to look at, is your organisation needing to do business in a different currency and not use US financial institutions, etc. But I think at a personal level, that's a very different thing. That's about knowing your limits, knowing who you are, knowing what you can and can't do, knowing what your skill set and experiences have given you over the team, and knowing what's lacking. And unfortunately for a lot of people, ego can take control. And the first thing in a crisis you need to do is park your ego in the basement, because you've got a lot of people and a lot of organisations that are relying on you. And the effect of what happens in your organisation is going to affect a whole lot of others. So your biggest asset in any organisation is your reputation. Now, I can go to an AICD course, or I can go to a lecture and give a guest lecture and ask people to write down what their best asset is in a course, in their organisation, and probably 1 in 10 will write reputation. Well, I'm here to tell those other 9 that reputation is as equally important as everything else, because if you don't have it, you don't operate. And you can see that every day, particularly in social media. So know all of your stakeholders, communicate. Can't say it enough, at all levels. We're going to talk about staff, I'd assume, at some stage, but staff internal communications is so important. And it's about taking them on the journey with you. They may not be happy, but you need to communicate with them and take them on the journey. And a crisis is when it's really time to show you're a true leader. You're not just a boss. You need to be prepared for the unexpected, and you need to create a culture right from the outset that says bad news rises quickly without fear of retribution. So there's a lot in that, but there's some of my sort of key takeaways. But it all boils down to a leader versus boss, and sometimes, you know what, in a crisis, you actually have to be the boss. You have to give direction, and you have to do it without fear. But you need to show the leadership agility to be able to wrap your arms around the people that you need to do that, and show them that you care and that they're a valued part of the team.
I think this is such an important reminder that as a leader, your job is not to be liked by everyone, but to do the best for everyone. And sometimes it is to make the tough decisions and to let people go or to promote people. And, you cannot please everybody anyway, but also what you said, let your ego in the car park. So many people, professionals, get promoted to finally have this title, and it's all about them. And this is exactly where usually things go pear-shaped, because this is not somebody people want to follow, but they obviously have to. And in the second there is a crisis or anything goes pear-shaped, everyone is out of there very quickly. Now, what you also mentioned before is having a strategic plan in place is key, and also strong governance and so forth. Now, having said that, how do you navigate having this strategic approach to it, but also navigating through the constantly changing market conditions that we are facing and so many uncertainties with news that we don't expect, but we obviously have to take in consideration?
Well, I think what you need to do is obviously create a culture that allows you to deal with changes, whether they be rapid or emerging. So that's about having everybody on the same team. I mean, the development of your strategy is really important, but it's how you actually implement the strategy and the way you go about the implementation, and then the targets that you set, how you're going to measure that implementation. That's really important. I mean, to some extent, every organisation, every market is changing, and it's always going to be changing. We're seeing that now with AI and a whole range of new technology. In fact, I think we're entering into if you like, almost another, not industrial revolution, but certainly a technology revolution in the way business is conducted, and all the challenges that come with that about security and privacy protections and things like that. But so it's important that you have the right culture. It's important that the people that you bring into the organisation fit the culture. Sadly, for some that are in the organisation, as things change, won't make it. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because you can develop people, you can bring them along on the journey, but at the same time, if you've got to make some hard decisions, you need to make hard decisions. But I really implore employers doing that to not just do the whole redundancy thing, to actually sit down and give people who they're exiting some guidance and some support, because that's really important to their mental health and to their job prospects going forward. So always try and be the person who's helping, and don't be the boss that they talk about that just let you go over a text message or without some really good feedback and consultation. So for me, ensuring that your organisation stays competitive is about talent, but it's also about ensuring that you're constantly aware you are against your competitors. It's about ensuring that you're adhering to your strategic plan. If you find yourself in an organisation where you aren't, or you can't, and it does happen, then revisit it. Revisit it. There's no harm in revisiting a strategic plan and adjusting it or tweaking it to suit a changing environment. That's a pivot, and the culture that you develop will allow you to do that with a great deal of ease if you develop the right culture.
Absolutely. And also what you said before, it's all about communication and also explaining why did we make this change, or what does it mean to you? And you mentioned talents and culture a few times. Obviously, it's reputation that's most important. As said, in the immediate second or one first and a bit place is culture and your team that you've got around yourself. Currently, and we've seen it for a while now, we are seeing a very challenging talent landscape from both angles. The talents are looking for the right fit, and they either don't get callbacks, they don't get even considered for opportunities where they would be a perfect fit. Companies can't seem to find the right talent. There is a lot of tension in the market. What are some of the strategies in especially tough situations to attract and also keep the best talents, and also whilst having to sometimes be the boss who has to make the tough decision, keep the loyalty of your staff? What is your experience in navigating this challenge?
Look, this is a really big area that we're dealing with at the moment. We have got a tight market, and I often hear companies saying, oh, we can't attract good talent. And I ask them, well, what are you doing to actually help yourself? And I wrote an article last week for those listening. That's on LinkedIn, and it's about, in a tight market, candidates require transparency from the bosses too. So in effect, the employer or potential employer is a candidate as well. So there needs to be openness and transparency on both sides of the equation, and you need to give the candidate enough to actually want them to engage with you and to come and give up the security of their current arrangements to come and work with you. I mean, at the end of the day, you're seeking a candidate because they can assist your business. So it's your responsibility to assist them as best you can to get them in the front door. Having done that, it's not always about money. I think what we need to do is understand the candidate's needs. We've probably all heard of the hierarchy of needs, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So you really need to understand what drives people at an individual level. And sometimes that is financial. For some people, it's very financial. And I've had conversations where, people will come and go over $5,000 or $10,000 in a package or a potential package at the end of the year. But I've had others who have said, you know what, it's not about the money. In fact, I've gone into roles myself that hasn't necessarily been about the money, because it's been about the challenge and the value that I can add and create. So I think there's a whole range of, avenues you can use. If you're trying to retain talent and you're in a crisis, you'll need to look at, maybe retention strategies. So, is a retention bonus actually appropriate in the circumstance? I've been into organisations where, the CFO has been absolutely critical to the success of the reform, and I've put in place with unashamedly, and it's quite a legitimate cost, to retain the CEO, because that CEO essentially knows where the bodies are buried, and has known what has been the cause of most of it as well, and sometimes has been stopped from speaking up, and is really looking forward to the opportunity of being able to make a more valuable contribution. So retention bonuses are there. When it comes to bringing new people in, sometimes if you really need the person, it's something like a sign-on bonus. It might be an equity share scheme that gives a long-term incentive. It might be short-term bonuses based around KPIs, but it could also be things like work flexibility. It could be, access to childcare. And there's a whole range of others. It's, can I work from home 3 days a week or 2 days a week? And, is there car parking available? Because that's a big expense these days, particularly in, metropolitan cities like Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne. So there's a range of I think, avenues that you can explore. But you need to really understand what the candidate is looking for, and remember that it's not just money in a lot of cases.
Absolutely, especially now that
I'm going to just add,
please.
you want to be the employer in a market, in a tight market. You want to be the employer that everybody talks about for the right reasons. You want to be the person that when you're having a coffee with your friend who's the CFO or the CTO at the organisation down the road, they go, "Oh my God, have you heard about so and so? They've done this, 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 and this for their employees. I'd love a job there."
Comes back to reputation again, just the opposite way in the end.
It does, for sure.
And, I'm so glad you mentioned the individual attractiveness packages or offers, because we've got now 5 generations in the workforce, and what success looks like to the boomer generation may not resonate with the Gen X and Gen Y. Like, it may not always be just because of an age, but it might be because of the situation or the context that the person is in. So simply having a conversation, identifying what is it actually that drives you and how can we make this happen within what we've got to offer is often the answer. But this is also what it requires, actually, to take the time out of your day and to dedicate resources on that.
I mean, somebody reaching closer to retirement age who's been fortunate enough to have good jobs is probably financially secure for their retirement. They own they're most likely to own their own property there, but they don't want the corporate stress anymore. They don't want to be in a full-time role, basically counting numbers every day and trying to reach a KPI, but they are prepared to contribute. So we shouldn't also rule out a generation because of where they're at in life. We can probably understand that there's some jealousy around that. But on the other extreme, you've got young people now entering the workforce with huge HECS debts. The ability to own a home is slightly, is probably out of reach for a large majority of them, unless they get some very good advice and they're very fortunate. So their drivers are going to be very different to the person in their late 50s and 60s. But all of them have something to offer. And, for those people in the later generation of life, nearing retirement, they're perfect candidates for things like advisory boards and being able to help companies in the way that they have experienced and done themselves, but in a more part-time basis, but really feel like they're contributing.
100%. And this is, I think, also what we're trying to educate, that a talent solution may not be a full-time employment engagement because it may not suit the talent, but it could also be a benefit for the organization to not have the permanent overhead costs that come with having a full-time employee. And having, as you just said, an advisory board, for example, to work on a specific challenge or topic might be exactly what you need for a fraction of the cost that would be contributed to a full-time employee or executive.
And I think the way our political system works, I think we're going to see more advisory boards. I think, particularly in those human services type departments, we're seeing to some degree in aged care around user advisory boards and clinical advisory boards. But what I think we'll see is I think a rollout where in organisations such as childcare and others that have in essentially that human element, there'll be a greater degree of governance requirement from a government perspective or a funding perspective. So I think watch this space going forward, and if you're in those areas, by all means, get on top of it before it's thrust upon you by people who aren't necessarily operating in your space and don't know the intricacies and cost models and things like that. But because politics isn't about understanding that, it's about reacting to public furor in many cases, which can be unfortunate.
Absolutely. And, in the end, what it comes down to, again, is how to create this winning culture, what you just mentioned, but just with different dynamics. As I said, the 5 generations, bring them together as one culture, but then also having the advisory board members as part of the bigger culture. They may not be included in the day-to-day operations, but how can you still attract people with similar value system but different and diverse skill sets? Now, you've built very strong teams and cultures, and everyone is obviously always interested in what did you do to get there? Like, what are the winning key elements to build this culture that also stand with you when times are tough?
Well, to me, there's 5 key aspects of a good culture. There's probably more, but I mean, you can almost build a culture, a checklist for culture out of a whole range of things. But I mean, they all get down to things like values, ethics, transparency, performance, accountability, and measurability. To me, if you've got those aspects embedded in your culture and in your strategic plan, your implementation and business plans, then you're on a very good path. But I think you don't only have to, this is not about a poster on the wall in the hallway. This is about living those key aspects, particularly around values, ethics, and accountability. You cannot live them enough. And if your organisation in any way, shape, or form detours from living good values and good ethics, you're in trouble. And I've been there. I've had to tidy up the mess of some of those. And what that means to an individual can be very different. So this is about socialising those issues within your teams and being very clear about what your expectation as the leadership is. And that starts from the board and goes all the way to the front reception desk. So it's the way you treat people. It's the values you instill about the way you treat your customers, your suppliers. It's how you engage. It drives how you engage with people. It drives how you respond. So all of these things are really important, in my view, about getting the right culture. And if you do that, then things that pop up, those potholes in the strategy road, or those crises, whether they're big or small, will become inevitably easier to handle because you've got a team of people who know what the limits are, know what they have to do, and they also aren't afraid to raise issues of concern. And if you're in an organisation and you've got a manager who you are so scared to raise a non-performance or a crisis issue with, then you've got a cultural issue, and that needs to be addressed. And sometimes you need an external person to come in and help with that, to identify it, because no one is actually game to put their finger up or their hand up in the meeting and actually say it. So that's a fairly brief description of what can be a very broad issue, which goes to a whole range of policies and procedures that you must have in your organisation. But they're the key critical issues for me.
And it's also a sensitive issue, because when you've got a personal issue with as an executive or a board member, and you are worried about your own job and your own reputation, often it's this watermelon effect that people saying, oh yeah, everything is green and we're good to go. And inside it's boiling, and it's just a matter of time when it actually explodes. And this is usually where it's too late. And this is where we've got people like yourself who actually go in and assess board performance, but then also the executive leadership performance from an independent perspective, because there's no personal agenda on there, and this is how you can quickly identify where the issues and what can we do to address them.
And look, just can I just add to that? We all need to be vulnerable about that. There's no sacred cows in this, to term a phrase. I mean, I myself went into a leadership role, and in a conversation with somebody who worked directly for me, made a comment that woman didn't in any way, shape or form find offensive, but a woman who overheard it standing a few metres away did, and pulled me up on it. And I said to her, oh, look, I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to be offensive, but can we go and have a coffee and a chat and talk to me about why you found that offensive? And to her, it wasn't a workplace issue, it was a personal issue. But once I understood that personal issue, I also understood where I'd failed in my duty of care to that individual. But, so 2 women, similar age, similar backgrounds, but very different perspectives on something. But easily fixed if you're prepared to admit your weaknesses and attack them head on.
Well, this is where we come full circle. When you started with, it comes down to knowing yourself and having the self-awareness as to what you can do, what you can't do, what are your strengths and weaknesses, and who do you need to be surrounded by to complement what you bring to a table. Because having the same skill set in an organization, that's the worst thing that you can have. You must obviously have the same values and the same beliefs, but at the same time, you want to be surrounded with people with different and contributing skill sets to identify areas and topics and opportunities that you may not see.
Petra, I went into an organisation once that had it was coming up to its 90th birthday in operation. It had a board of 22. All of them were men, all of them in their middle age, and we had the opportunity to elect, because the members were elected by regional areas, our first female director in 90 years. And one of the directors asked that we have a in-committee session to talk about how they're going to operate with a woman in the room. And I was completely astounded. And when we got into committee, I said, I mean, I can't even believe that in this day and age we're having this discussion. I said, don't you realise that you've had a CFO sitting there for the last 9 years who's a woman, and your minute taker who sits in the corner who's been here for 20 odd years is a woman, and you're having a discussion about how you should treat women in a boardroom sense. How are you going to operate? And I went, operate like you would expect to operate in front other people to operate in front of any woman in your family, with respect, and give them the same opportunity that you've been given. It was a very short conversation, but it just astounded me that we still had that attitude in the last 10 years.
Yeah. And I don't think it's completely gone either, to be honest. It's just maybe a bit of a broader conversation, how to integrate certain other demographics or, different talent solution.
Look, it's not gone. And I also, talking about me a bit, but for the context of the conversation, I was appointed the first chair of the Council for Australian Arab Relations. It was a new organisation, new body set up by the federal government, and the board I was given was all men. And I said, where's the diversity? And I went to the minister and I requested that we appoint some women, and the minister agreed to that, which was good. And to me, it just wasn't the right approach in the first instance, and I was surprised that at a government level that would have still happened. I don't think it had happened today, obviously.
There are other challenges.
There are.
Well, that brings me probably to the final question. People out there, leaders, soon to be leaders, executives, board directors, they are questioning what is it that we need to look out for to prepare for this next world of work. How do we navigate those complex landscapes? What advice would you give them to stay excited, to stay inspired, and to be the rock there when everyone else is looking for all the answers and nobody's got the one silver bullet?
Oh, look, I think being very clear on what your purpose is, why you're doing what you're doing. If your business isn't clear about that, and unfortunately, there's a lot of mum and dad businesses that I think lose focus on what their raison d'etre is, because they're a bit like ducks. They're calm on the surface, but they're paddling like crazy against the stream, and that's not going to get easier as if we have increased interest rates, inflation stays high. Talent is scarce. Those things are going to be more difficult. So it's I think what we will see is, for those organisations that are struggling, is in a sense a retraction back to core. So I think you can focus on getting rid of the periphery noise. Is it right to continue this expansion thing right at the moment? Yes, continue to do the planning, but is it right to hit the trigger? Do we need to actually put that on hold for a moment? Do we need to have a look at and focus on what costs we can move from fixed costs to variable costs, for example, without affecting our service offering or our product? but there's a whole range of things. And you know what? When things go quiet, don't panic. Look for the opportunity. And what does a quiet time present you in terms of an opportunity is a time to reflect, a time to review, review your strategic plan, review your financing arrangements. We're seeing changes in interest rates, etc. Review, your staffing requirements, review your cost structures, but also really take a close look at what your product is and what's moving and what's not moving. Because quiet time, when sort of that discretionary spend is depleted or taken away, it's what is your core that's going to stand you in good stead for the future.
Mm-hmm. I love this advice, and especially as we're heading now into this new financial year in Australia, everything over the last probably 6 to 9 months has felt it's on hold. Nothing is quite moving as fast. Decisions are being held on, like it's hard to put a finger on what's actually happening, but you can see it literally across every industry, every company, every size of organization that something is brewing, but it's at the same time very, very quiet. So, not panicking, I think it's probably the best advice.
And if you're in a fortunate position, slowdowns and crises can create opportunities for you, crises in other organizations. I mean, is there an opportunity for you to take out a competitor at a lower multiple because they're struggling and haven't done the things that you've fortunately done? So that, again, look for the opportunity. Always be on the lookout for the opportunity.
And speaking of the opportunity and the lookout, for anyone who is interested to learn more about you, Brandon, how you can help organizations to identify what are the opportunities that we may not see, or also assessing if the board, if the executive team is performing at their very best. What's the best way to connect with you and learn more about what you do?
Well, I think clearly through LinkedIn is probably the best way to get in touch with me. And we have contact details, numbers there. And also through, you can do a Calendly link and set up a time with me. And also through the website at the360talent.co. So there's lots of information out there, and look forward to helping as many people as we possibly can. Always look for the bright light on the horizon, because there's always going to be one. The sun will come up tomorrow, Petra, even though the weather's not great.
I agree. Well, thank you, Brandon. That was absolutely amazing. And we'll put all the links obviously in the show notes. And as you said, get out there and help as many people as we can for tomorrow.
Great. Thanks very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.